So when you use fire as a management tool, which obviously I've been setting up thing, is kind of how do you put this all together? And so you tend not to burn more than a third to a half of a given habitat type should be burned in one time. And habitat type refers to individual species. So a habitat type for bison is different than a habitat type for a meadowlark, but they're both grassland areas. And so you might want to say no, never more than never more than a third or half of an ecosystem should you be burning at one time. But you also should have planned internal refuges when you're actually looking at specific habitat types as it relates, because most of the insect species that are remnant dependent are often dependent upon individual species of plants, so that there are 3 species in Sauk County, there are 3 species of moth that require lead plant. And so you want to make sure that there are areas where you're not burning all of your lead plant within a prairie remnant, so that you can make sure that you're not extirpating one or all of these 3 species of lead plant moth that utilize them. You can also use natural landscape features to serve as refuges within burn units, but because of the story with, if you've got these very highly isolated remnants that are fairly good quality, you have to be very careful, because you need to plan for protecting precise species of plants so that you can protect precise species of insects that are dependent upon those plants. And that is harder to do if you're just allowing natural landscape features to protect them. So often you have to establish no burn refuges, such as what I showed you, and we'll talk about that again here in a little bit. The integrated pest management concept is important. So the line between the DNR land and this private land is stark, and I'm not taking a dig at DNR, but the difference between these two sides is 25 years of effort and a whole lot of work and an integration of fire and physical removal of plants. So you can't go from this kind of density of buckthorn to this with fire alone. And you can't go from this kind of density of buckthorn, which has almost nothing growing in the understory, and to this without fire. So that you need both the fire and the mechanical removal as you're dealing with these restoration efforts. But importantly, it takes a lot of effort and time. And that's a kind of thing that is really important in recognizing. And I think this is often the case with NRCS, is you have money to help landowners, but you don't have a lot of people to actually make that happen. And you're talking about a complicated system. And so there's trade-offs that exist in trying to deal with that. And it's important to figure out ways that you can kind of solve those problems, and yet, follow the rules of your job and to ecologically get meaningful results on the ground. And this is not an easy thing to do. And it's not something that we know the answer to, but is something that we can continually strive for. So again, cutting and spot herbicide and burning are great ways of doing integrated pest management for pest species that we have. And as an example of what fire alone can do, this is not a photo point, but this is what a typical oak forest in Sauk County looks like, which is a dominated shrub middle story, trees in the overstory, and almost nothing on the ground. But in a fire where fire has been repeatedly used, we've virtually eliminated that middle shrub story. The trees still survive, and we've increased the overall coverage of forbs in the understory, in the herbaceous layer. And the diversity is okay. But importantly, it takes 10 to 15 years to go from this to this. It is not a one fire kind of solution. This is basically 5 to 7 fires over 10 to 15 years to create this sort of effect. So these activities are not one-shot affairs. These activities require the commitment and the time to accomplish the kinds of results that we're looking for. And as such, they require a different way of thinking about funding, upon resources or capacity to actually do this sort of work. Um, all of those make it a very interesting problem to address, but also a very challenging one to do so. So management strategies you can have, if you look at the International Crane Foundation, most of these management units contain woods and grass, woods and grass, woods and grass, woods and grass, woods and grass in each of these areas. So my management strategy was to burn from oak forest at a high canopy coverage to oak forest with zero canopy coverage, otherwise known as prairie. And so I was burning across this gradient, not of moisture, but of shade, and burning across this gradient here, and burning across this gradient here, and burning across this gradient here, and so on. So my goals were to uh, use fire, but burn it across these ecological gradients to get the kind of results that I was interested in. And if we come back to this refugia sort of thing, creating refugias when you have isolated remnants where you are likely to have remnant dependent species is a critical component and is not the same thing as, say, uh, former ag land that's been invaded by grass, where we've got plenty of stuff for insects to go back and forth. These are fairly rare gems and need to be treated as such in terms of a management scenario. And that is where you create these no burn areas that are in the middle of a unit that you want to do. Now, this seems like a simple solution, but believe me, when you're actually doing a prescribed burn, this is me lighting around this no burn refugia. This required planning, and that we put in this no burn refugia a couple days before the prescribed burn was done. So it required us to identify this no burn area and to create the conditions where we could keep it from burning. And in this case, the photographer, I can't burn up the photographer. It creates more complicated fire behavior. It's a much greater effort to try and do this, so that it's not a simple thing, and yet it's a very important thing to do as you move forward. Another example, these are areas where these are two no burn refugias within this larger unit that we burn. This is for Lear Leaf rockcress, for Olympia marble that occur right around in this patch. And the only Lear Leaf rockcress that we had at very large quantities are right in this area. So this is actually protecting well over half of our population of Lear Leaf rockcress, which is a plant. And the Olympia marble have been able to persist with our prescribed fire. Here, there's a different butterfly species that's utilizing this area. But you can also see that when we burned this area the previous year, these were no burn refugias, and we didn't burn it in the current year when this was burned. And then we also burned these no burn refugias. So it's not that you can't ever burn these areas that you choose to have as no burn refugias. You just don't do them at the same time, so that you are still managing the whole area from fire, but you're doing it asynchronously. I generally don't encourage now going alternate years and that sort of thing, because it's just a lot more complicated and you're always burning in this area, and it's more difficult to do. So what I do now is try to do it as kind of still one-stop shopping. So if this is year one and this is where the no burn refugia is, the next year that I do that prescribed for fire, the no burn refugia might occur like this. And then the next year, the no burn refugia might occur like this, so that I'm always keeping, I'm moving where the no burn refugia is. So eventually I'm burning all of it, but never, at all at one time, if that makes sense. Conservation grazing is also really quite interesting. Even if we're dealing with cool season grasses, if you burn off those grasses, if you don't want to influence productivity, you burn off the grasses before they have greened up much, and you can still get very good nitrogen content and low lignin content in these grasses, which help with grazing in these areas. But the more that we try to contemplate how to shift conservation grazing to um, more native species that are in there, um, can be a really interesting manner in which we can combine agricultural use so that there's economic incentive to do these conservation practices, but also creating a greater bang for our conservation buck, and that we're increasing or improving biological diversity, whether they be birds or invertebrates, and plants, but also good agricultural production. There's lots of different types of conservation grazing that are done, various types of rotational grazing, mob grazing, which is an intentional type of rotational grazing, or patch grazing. And you guys actually know more about this than I do, but I'll touch on this briefly as it relates to conservation um, practices. So patch grazing is simply if you burn this area as a patch, and then let animals graze on their own with no fences involved, they will tend to burn in the first growing season, or I'm sorry, they will tend to graze in the area that's the first growing season since the last burn. And that's critical to keep in mind. If you overstock it, they'll eventually burn in other areas that are years, 2 growing seasons or 3 growing seasons since the last fire. But if you stock it properly, they'll stay within the burned area without any fences. Then in the next year, you can burn this area just with patches, not with fences, and the animals will shift and use that area, and then you burn this next year. So you're basically doing a rotational grazing just using fire. This is a little bit difficult to do in the Midwest because it's not utilizing all of your land, but it is more doable in out west where paddocks are larger and fencing is more difficult. And so this is a way of using rotation in a way that's not as is more cost effective. Let me put it that way. If you think about it, if you look at cool season versus warm season, so cool season is the black and warm season is the red. And of course, these aren't based on data, but I'm just doing this on a hypothetical basis. If you look at rate of growth for the plants and the season, winter, spring, summer, fall, and back to winter, warm season grasses are basically having their highest growth rates in the middle of the summer, whereas cool season grasses are primarily growing in the spring when soil temperature is above freezing but cool, and in the fall. So if you do a prescribed burn, what you're doing, especially if you do a prescribed burn when the cool season grass has already started to grow, you're resetting it. So the cool season grass is growing, growing, growing. You top kill it, and it will regrow. You top kill it here with a fire, and then it will regrow, but not so much, and a little bit later, and then it peters out because it gets into the soil temperatures that are warmer. So you have a less productivity. And this is what it would look like under normal circumstances with no fire. So a lot of growth that's occurring here, and then it drops off and becomes senescent in the hot summer months, and then it grows again in the fall. In a burn scenario, you probably have less growth in the fall that follows the first growing season since the last burn as well, because soil temperatures still remain quite large, but that effect is not quite as much. So the idea with grazing with natives is we have natives that are both act like warm season and act like cool season species, or are cool season species, and try to integrate these might create a better overall net productivity for this area. Because with current grazing practices, they're pretty much cool season pastures without any warm season pastures. So either you got to shift your cows to a place where you've planted warm season grasses, or if you have a native prairie sort of circumstance, you have these species that are intermixed. And that would be the concept of what you're trying to go with. The challenge with this, of course, if you're using native species, it takes such a long time for these systems to really develop to their fullest capacity. And to be honest, I haven't figured out how to address that. I've been poking around with it with various grazing folks that I work with, and burning, but we haven't by any stretch of the imagination solved this, though they've done quite a bit more with grazing out west than here in the Midwest. The bottom line is that this production of below ground is really critical overall to what it is that we're talking about. Um, and in part, what I mean by that is if we're going to do something as audacious as to go from burning 75,000 acres per year to burning 1 million acres per year, there is cost and effort that is going to be required to accomplish that goal. It's got to be worth it if you're going to do it. Part of the worth it is the other benefits that you get by getting fire on that landscape and working with these native ecosystems. And those other benefits are accrued very readily given the long-lived nature of most of the native species that we have. And so said in another way, it's what's going on underneath the ground that really gives us our bang for our buck, because this is where carbon gets stored. This is where more ground or more surface water infiltration occurs. This is where water quality improves. This is where biological diversity is in part occurring because of all of these habitats that are essentially existing for invertebrate species that are in the ground. This is where our aesthetic value often comes. This is where all of these things come together and can create a very powerful way of moving forward. So it can be worth the uh, additional effort that it's going to take to get there. And it's really important to keep in mind that ecological underpinning um, needs to be recognized, and our systems that we create are relevant to that. So space and time are both relevant as we work with this. And you can have statewide programs. We have many landowner incentive program. LIP, of course, you guys know this better than anybody, with the crop reserve program or EQIP or all the various acronyms, and I don't even know what they are now. You guys know that much better than I do. So that we have that, but we also have to understand that time is an important part of this, not just in terms of are you buying the land or doing easements, or even are you doing it on a cultural basis because people are doing it because it's in their interest to do it and will continue to do it because it's in their continued interest to do it. Those are different ways that you can incorporate time. And to some extent, that cultural input, even though it takes longer to do, can be an important component of this, and it matches better to how long it takes prairies to actually develop and that sort of thing. So, in working with agricultural producers, we've been doing that. So, for example, we have areas that we've done prairie plantings and managing them for 25 years now on potato farms. Um, and it's still being done, but there's no easement, there's no purchase of land. It's based on a cultural basis, and there's a program that supports it. So it's not impossible, but it's also not yet a panacea. In that we can't show it at a scale and space that's big enough. So there's a competition between these two different scales of time and space. And that's a really important concept of understanding as you move forward in terms of working with these landowners. So we have the landowner incentive program in Wisconsin, the managed forest law, which is a state program, and of course your programs with the USDA, and also the Fish and Wildlife Service has extensive programs, so that there are incentives and subsidies that are out there, and they are good. I'm not being disparaging at all about them. But there also are environmental labels which can be used to deal with some of these issues, but those environmental labels need to be broad enough to work for all these things. So organics often doesn't incorporate some of the biological diversity, for example, whereas something like healthy grown doesn't deal with some of the things that organics deals with in terms of it reduces pesticide risk, but it doesn't change it fundamentally, which is what is done with organics. Savannah Institute is doing things like perennial polyculture, which the Land Institute has done, but they're doing it from a Savannah point of view. So that there's a lot of issues that are out there that we could do a better job at integrating and informing into advancing as we move forward. Almost all of these issues do involve fire ultimately. And of course, that cultural transference can be really important. And even just as simple as, not even as simple, but in an important way of saying, how do we sell land with the values of these long-term management occurring? So what good does it do if I do a great job for 30 years restoring the oak savannas that I'm looking out right now, and yet I can't do it in such a way that if my wife and I sell this land, which is our retirement fund, and have a reasonable assuredness that somebody else will continue those management activities. And that's not just a easement sort of issue. That's also, is there the capacity to do the prescribed burning or to do the activities or to care to do it? There's all kinds of issues that are related to that. And as Leopold said, at what point will governmental conservation, like the mastodon, become handicapped by its own dimensions? In other words, we can't buy it all. We can't do easements on it all. We have to find ways that culturally we are able to be good stewards of the land in such a way that we can that we can solve our environmental problems that are land-based, like global warming, like declining biological diversity, like groundwater recharge, like soil erosion, those sorts of things. We need to find better ways of wrapping those up into these issues. And of course, fire is a fundamental component of that because it's what drives prairie systems and savanna systems, and it's those deep rooted systems that drive these environmental solutions. In part, as you guys well know, most of the land in Wisconsin is still privately owned. And so this has to be real ecological scale can only be met on these privately owned lands. So we need to up our game wherever we live, however we can, and we need to do it in a time frame that matters because these remnants are disappearing. And yet at the same time, by getting bigger, we need to be safe as well as effective, and we need to cooperate. Thanks.